Thank you for listening to episode 22 of Lift as We Rise. My name is Roshni Gadger, and today the conversation is taking a deep dive into the topic of sustainability and ESG from the perspectives of corporates, investors, consumers, and we're bringing the competition law into it. So to those who are new to sustainability and to those who've been in it for a number of years now already, where are we? Where we are now, we are 33 years post the Exxon Valdez oil spill that happened on the Alaskan coast. We are 25 years post the launch of the first global reporting initiative, and we are 12 years after the BP Deep Horizon incident. Whether anything will actually change by 2030, that's up for debate, particularly in a country like South Africa, where our basic systems and services seem to be broken. So corporates get the rap for chasing profits, governments stick to the politics, and consumers then face the pressures of rising inflation, systemic inequalities, and of course, supply chain disruptions. Among the marketing side, we've got commercial greenwashing, and that's producing disinformation, and it's doing very little to drive sustainable consumer behavior. So if we have to move now from profits and politics to purpose, what practical action steps do we need to take to move that business to consumer value chain and evolve it? With me today on the panel to speak about this topic, I'm joined by the JSE Sustainability Officer, Shamila Subramani, the CEO of the Advertising Standards Board, Gail Schimmel, and competition law expert and director at Norton's Incorporated, Anton Roots. Shamila, Gail, and Anton, welcome, and thank you so much for making time to be here today.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Roshni.
So before we dive into it, like I said, there's a cross-section of people listening in today. From your perspectives at the JSE, in the advertising industry, and from the competition law perspectives, what have been some of the key items or developments in your space, either related to sustainability or the developments over the past 2 years? Shamila, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Roshni, and hi to everybody listening to us. It's a pleasure to be here, and also for this timeless conversation, and I'm loving the mix of people that are having this discussion. If I look at what's happened, I think particularly, I would say over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen a notable uptick in at least the awareness of sustainability issues and the need to consider them more carefully. The pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that we've recently lived through, and in some instances are still living through, has been one of those areas that has served to, for example, make it very clear what the deficiencies in relation to those issues that we talk about when we talk about sustainability has actually led to, and what the consequences have been. So if we look at that, there's no doubt that some of those consequences have been financial. We're seeing that in many ways and forms. We've seen what that's led to in terms of government spending, largely just to be able to take healthcare accessibility to people, then deal with the economic fallout of job losses and the like. And we've seen what that's meant in terms of rising debt levels in a number of countries, and usually in those that can ill afford it. So we tend to see a greater fracturing, and we're starting to see that, that we saw those fault lines actually just so much more visible in terms of what the inequality has meant and what it's meant to try to catch up with those things, just to be able to help people deal with the pandemic, for example. We've now seen deeply indebted countries. So we're starting to see the financial consequences quite severely of not being able to deal with these issues when they do arise on a scale that they have. And we can certainly link the pandemic and its roots down to environmental issues, for example. And then we're seeing the social consequences, right? Roshni, you sketched a really, really great outline initially to bring us into, where we sit at the moment. So I certainly am seeing that the big trends have been around understanding that these issues are actually financial. Now, on one hand, you think, well, that's great because now once we can start quantifying it, hopefully we'll do something about it. But that's not the only issue. The issue has been that up to now, a lot of what we've done is internalize profit and externalize cost. And our business models have largely precipitated this. And so this is something that we need to deal with collectively at a systemic level to start changing and understanding, first and foremost, that we operate within a context of boundaries and not infinity. So even growth models that we pursue up to now that look at hopefully limitless growth year on year are not really feasible when you think that that needs to happen within the context of boundaries. And I feel a little bit like a stuck record, because in a few different panels in the last few weeks kind of said the same thing. But I think that the acknowledgement that we live within a set of finite boundaries first and foremost is important, and that once we start exceeding those, we put ourselves at risk of things happening that we really cannot properly quantify. I mean, one of those that we've been able to quantify in terms of, for example, planetary boundaries has been on climate change, where we know we've got to limit, the emissions of carbon to a certain level to be able to try and minimize the impact of climate change and what would happen if we don't stay within that limit. So those are the kinds of things that the conversations that we need to actually be having across a number of the other planetary boundaries. And also understanding that within the context of those boundaries, we need to ensure solid social foundations. And, you talked about inequality, you talked about many of those things, but what are the things as basic in terms of social foundations that we need to create? So all of the wealth creation that we're looking at, all of the growth that we're looking at, if it doesn't work within those boundaries and is not serving to at least help maintain those basic social foundations, then we're sitting with these fractures that we're seeing right now. So I think the contextualization within boundaries is very important, because very quickly the sustainability ESG landscape comes down to a risk perspective. And risk is always helpful, right? Because it usually makes us sit up, take notice, and want to do something differently. But understanding the how we need to do things is perhaps the missing part of the debate sometimes. And the trend has been now to start even questioning, for example, the approaches that have typically been followed around ESG, and moving hopefully towards a bigger lens, which is sustainability. And that I think I've sketched out, right, in terms of having boundaries and needing to achieve certain context for society within that. So everything we do within business needs to start thinking about that. And I think you probably heard it said before that no business can thrive in a society and environment that is failing. You're dependent on those things ultimately long term for your survival. And so understanding these things differently needs to happen. Part of what we've obviously had up to now is that because of the way in which our models have developed, that have been quite linear, and we want to look for this limitless growth year on year, for example, we're not really considering these externalities. So we internalize the profit, like I said, and we externalize cost. And now we're starting to see that once we start pricing in these externalities into our business models, for example, that you're starting to look at even what you think is driving a profit and what is a feasible business model very differently. And so those are things are starting to change. I think a greater acknowledgement that we need to work collaboratively, and we'll probably get to that later, is certainly there in existence. And I'm sure Anton is going to help us a lot with understanding some of the issues with competition, for example, around these. But those are the major trends we're starting to see. You've touched on greenwashing, and I think that aligns a little bit with what I've said already about saying that, if we're trying to do this and we're looking, for example, the amount of capital flows that have gone into sustainability related instruments or ESG tagged instruments globally, it's been staggering amounts of money. And in some asset classes has been by and large the biggest growth sector within asset classes as well. But the questions around what actually constitutes a sustainable investment has become the issue now more recently, and we're starting to see, for example, even regulation coming down the line that is starting to hamper people who are labeling products as ESG products and saying, well, actually, what are the criteria that you use to be able to make that claim? So those are certainly the trends that we're seeing. There's a level of social consciousness that I think that has grown exponentially as well. And we're starting to see that manifest in different ways. I think, you can see that whether it's service delivery protests or whether it's actually climate-related protests, the fact is that civil society awareness is growing, and the expectation being placed on business to become more responsible is certainly growing. The other way we're seeing that manifesting, for example, is in shareholder activism, right? And in different types of resolutions now being brought to board, most notably on climate-related issues, saying, we want to know, what are you doing? What is your policy? How are you changing, for example, in line with the Paris Agreement and changing your business? So those sorts of trends, I think, are the ones that we need to look at. And we need to see what that means in terms of the fundamental ask, which really is changing how we think about our business models and how that relates into this broader context of boundaries. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Roshni.
Thanks, Shamila. I mean, the JSE has been at this since 2004. It's been one of the early adopters of sustainability ESG. And I hear what you're saying. One of my questions I had during, a recent conversation was, do we always have to wait for a crisis to push us into positive action? Let's call it that. Or are we going to start adopting a proactive stance towards that? And that really is what this conversation about. Thanks, Shamila. Let's turn our heads then to the advertising and marketing industry. Gail, from your perspective, what is the role of the OB in South Africa, and what are some of the headlines in your space at the moment?
Okay, well, I feel like I'm going to seem like a very brief person compared to Shamila, because I don't have nearly as much exciting information to share. But what I think is important, I think, first of all, to understand the Advertising Regulatory Board, which is the body that I'm the CEO of, deals with the content of advertising. So where we come into this conversation is touching on what you guys have been saying about greenwashing claims and all claims around in sustainability, environmental issues, as we used to call it, all that sort of thing. Now, this is a really hot point internationally. They receive a lot of complaints about issues around this, and it's become a hot point that we discuss at international meetings a great deal. South Africa, it's not a hot point. We have not received a single complaint from consumers around this issue for years. I think we all more worried about keeping our lights on than where the energy for our lights is actually coming from. But that having been said, we still know that what always happens in the advertising space is if you see a trend internationally, it will come to South Africa eventually. So we are preparing ourselves, and we are in the process of drafting a new appendix to our code. When we deal with special issues around advertising, we have an appendix to the code, and we are in the process of drafting a new appendix around sustainability claims. And the wonderful thing about being a little bit behind the others coming to the party is that we can learn from everybody. So we have a lot of amazing international documents that we can learn from and that we're working into our code. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to have a world-class code on sustainability claims. Are consumers going to start complaining about these issues? I don't know.
Gail, that's super interesting. And for, I guess, Shamila and myself who've been this for a while, Shamila is immersed in this topic. I often feel like I just don't know enough to take positive action. And so I'm not surprised that from the consumer side, from the advertising industry side, has it been a case of those in the boardrooms and the regulatory space have been talking to date and making it a little bit too complicated for the rest to understand. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. Thanks, Gail. Anton, from your perspective, what are, in a nutshell, the competition law objectives, and what has been happening recently in this space?
I mean, at this particular conference, I sort of said, we've had these issues in a different context with state capture and things where, we were going through all of that, and you had people NGOs and the like, trying to proactively take steps. And one of the Canadian guys said, well, you should see what's happening in Canada. So, it's, I think this is not obviously we've got potentially more challenges. And I think then the other point that as Gail was talking, and I think it's also a point that Shamila raised, is this issue of what do we deal with? These are critical issues, these are long-term sustainable issues, but at the same time we're facing critical issues today. And so we're sticking plasters on those critical issues. And I think from a competition law perspective, it's very similar. You've got a Competition Act, which is really aimed at process, if I can put it that way. The process is to ensure that you have a competitive economy. You've got parties competing with each other because the intuition is that you get benefits that flow to consumers and to society more generally if you have a competitive economy. But then the question is, should competition law be dealing with issues like inequality? Should competition law in South Africa be dealing with issues such as transformation? And those are the two sort of burning points in a sense at the moment. And the question is, when you're dealing with those things, how does one look at something broader, which is obviously very critical, this proactively driving ESG type of initiatives, in the context of a piece of legislation that says when competitors engage with each other, there's certain things that they can't engage with because that can start having an impact on the competitive process. And it's quite complex. If there's an exemption in the Competition Act, it says that the Act doesn't apply to concerted conduct designed to achieve non-commercial socio-economic objectives. What are those? Because as soon as something that I'm doing gives me a competitive advantage, then that is potentially no longer a non-commercial socioeconomic objective. And, to go back to the critical issue for today's debate, as I see it, is where you have two competitors discussing an initiative or engaging on a particular initiative, whatever it happens to be. And I think you and Shamila and Gail will fill that in as the conversation develops. That can be something which gives rise to risk. And I think what's happened with the Competition Act is there have actually been a number of amendments in the last number of years where previously there was some conduct which was, if I can speak colloquially, so bad that if you're engaged in price fixing or the like, it's 10% penalty or a maximum of a 10% penalty. But then there was different type of conduct where it was more of a weighing act. And you say, does the agreement or the understanding or the action that we take collectively have an anti-competitive effect? If so, is it outweighed by certain benefits, efficiency benefits, which is obviously far more kind of economic benefits, technological benefits, or pro-competitive gains? And you had this weighing exercise. And if you got it wrong, it was only the second time that you got it wrong that you would be penalized. The problem is, as of a few years ago, that's now been changed, and a first-time offence is now penalizable by an administrative penalty. So in some senses, the risk of getting it wrong has now increased, which is potentially also not helpful for the things that we're discussing. Roshni, I don't know if that's a helpful start from my side.
Thanks, Anton. I mean, competition law is a complex space, so thanks for distilling that in a very easy to understand manner. And I think what I'm hearing from all of us is that action to date has been slow. This is an important area that requires focus. But if we're fair, Shamila, I mean, at 2020, sustainable asset investments under management were about 35 trillion. And I think Bloomberg Intelligence is saying that by 2025, that will reach about 53 trillion. What are your thoughts on sustainability, how far it's come now, and where it's positioned in the South African context?
Yeah, so the first comment, I think, Roshni, is on those numbers, right? I think my comment earlier around looking at what is labeled as ESG assets might actually end up possibly with those numbers changing and maybe even being reduced, because as that lens is shone on them as to what, or the magnifying glass, I should say, as to what actually constitutes an ESG investment, you could end up seeing that less of those actually make the hurdle to qualify as that. So let's see where those numbers go, and how that changes as we're starting to see regulation come down the line. And so that's an element I want to touch on as well, is that largely, up until very recently, most activity in this space is not regulated, right? The labeling, the what you call in that, all of those kinds of things, even if, for example, looking at disclosures on sustainability, have not been mandatory mostly around the world. So we're seeing, that and you're talking about progress and what's happened over time. I think because a lot of it has played in that space where there hasn't been mandatory disclosure regulation, for example, is that it's kind of been like a nice to have. Right? And add on, put this into my report. Maybe there's a particular set of stakeholders I've engaged with that really wants to know, and then I better put it in there, because if I don't, then maybe they'll make a bit of noise or something like that. And so the pressing need to change and to actually do more has not been there. And again, go back to internalizing profit, externalizing cost, not really understanding the actual impact on society, the environment, those sorts of things. So when we look at now and where we are, we need to think about the fact that, those things are changing. We're certainly seeing other jurisdictions, for example, coming down with more tangible policy regulation in that space. The EU probably most notable right now. And interesting about the EU, I find, is that they have a vision and a strategy, which is the EU Green Deal. And then all the laws and the regulation that you're seeing happening now, in one way or another, are actually there to enable the achievement of that objective, of their vision, of saying this is what we're going to decarbonize to and all of that. So whether it's the regulation that's coming down on what companies need to disclose, whether it's the actual emissions reduction requirements in certain industries and sectors, and even the labeling, for example, and what the financial services needs to do, you can actually see that there's a reason for it and how it stacks up. And so we are starting to see other jurisdictions take that, look at that lead and say, well, what do we need to do? Within the South African context, I mean, it's obviously broad and I can't opine on all of it, but I can certainly say that from the regulatory context, which is what maybe we're asking, right? Why is the progress slow? Why we're not doing more? And we want to look at maybe regulation. There's definitely a need for a more unified regulatory approach that says, what do we need to achieve as a country? And therefore, how is that going to translate into the relevant disclosure laws or guidance or what we think is appropriate for our country? And so that, I think, has been a little bit maybe behind the more leading jurisdictions, but also I think we need that room to be able to say that our challenges need to be contextualized, right? We need to be able to understand that we're sitting in a country with massive inequality, with huge unemployment, and we've got a number of those issues to deal with, in many instances, not even access to basic services. And so those things are challenges we need to solve for while we're dealing with the environmental context, for example, and looking at the broader sustainability landscape. So the need to really take leadership in saying what is right for us in this context, and that makes sure that we show up as being responsible for a global, what is actually a global issue that we need to tackle, and how do we do that in our fair circumstances? How do we do that fairly within our context of operating and our level of development and the like? So those conversations are happening. They're featuring in things like, the COP26, for example. Yes, it's a climate agenda, but it is very tied to many of the social issues, because we know that runaway climate change is actually going to exacerbate many of the social issues we have, because usually it is those that are the most vulnerable, which is the poorest people, the most disenfranchised, that are actually going to bear the brunt of many of those issues. So that context in South Africa, I think, we're seeing bits of that emerge now. We've got the climate bill that's happened. We've got other things that are going on within the financial sector, which is what I'm closest to, obviously. We've got the Climate Risk Forum, for example, which has been put together under National Treasury, that is looking at acting on the recommendations of a paper that Treasury put out a few years ago called Financing a Sustainable Economy. And so there are elements in there that are being dealt with now. What that looks like in translating into regulation, mandatory disclosure, or mandatory need to take action will be seen over time as that work matures. But one proof point, of course, is the fact that we have a carbon tax in the country. Obviously, questions around whether it's enough are there, but we're seeing that there are elements of these things coming into play. What is missing for me is a coherence at a higher level that makes it clear what we need to achieve, where that links to global commitments and where the local context sits within that, and that helps us apply our collective mind to then what each of us needs to do in the different sectors. However, Roshni, I do want to say that even in the absence of that clarity, I think we already know enough to know that we need to act in whichever way we can in our different sectors already. And the JSE's work, for example, in this area has been, what can we do within those constraints we have right now? Which levers can we use to try and promote creating an enabling environment for better sustainability practices to grow? And in that regard, for example, we've looked at what we can influence on regulation, small lever, which is listed companies. And there we said at the highest level, we've embedded the King Codes of Corporate Governance, because really it's a governance issue, right? The stewards within those companies, the people actually applying their mind, need to have applied integrated thinking, need to be considering all of these issues as material, looking at environmental and social issues and thinking about that in their business model. So the King Code, for example, which is mandatory for companies to do on an apply and explain basis if you're listed, and puts that responsibility there. But what it doesn't do is give you a tick box of these 30 things you need to disclose on sustainability, saying apply your mind, think what's material, think about it in an integrated way, and start reporting on that. Then the other things we can do is try and make the instruments available to move the money to particular things that are actually aligned with sustainable development outcomes. And so creating those instruments, there's a bit of a braveness that's required there, right? To be able to create instruments that you don't know if people are going to use. And so you need to say, build it and they'll come. And are we taking leadership in doing that, which is what we've tried to do, and have created a number of sustainability instruments, for example. And then using our voice and advocacy and engagement and saying, how do we bring together, for example, in our case, the issue and investor community to understand better what these issues are, bring them closer together so that they can start understanding and acting. If it's an issue who's disclosing information that's used by an investor, or an investor requiring better information to be able to understand the business of that issue or that listed company and how it impacts on society and environment, for example, those are things we're trying to have those conversations on and seeing what we can drive as an exchange within our confines of our operation. So, and then how do we influence that ecosystem, right? Because there's an ecosystem that's sitting with regulation, policy, and can we participate in those discussions to be able to say, let's bring the might of the markets into the discussion and see how we can use that as a catalyst within our own country for the different things that we need to do, including how do we look good to attract foreign direct investment into our country. Investment that more and more now is going to be looking at us with its regulation, which is a sustainability lens, right? And so those are the things I think we're trying to do. And so there's a lot of work to be done in South Africa, certainly, but there's no time to wait. Each sector has to find what it can do now.
Shamina, thanks very much. There's so much in what you said that we can unpack even further, because each of them are topics on their own. Because the principle of integrated thinking, can you get there when in South Africa we're dealing with basic systemic issues? And in the city I'm living in, the Nelson Mandela Bay, we know that there's a water crisis, not so much only because of climate change issues, but because of water leaks not being fixed. The Water Chamber recently issued a report, I think it was this week, saying that in South Africa, there's 40% of water is lost due to leaks, 60% of water is of poor quality, and it's going to take about R1 trillion for real mitigation efforts that are going to address these issues effectively. And that problem is so big that I don't think any individual sector in the private sector or public sector can tackle that independently. So, this call for collaboration is loud. But my question always has been, are we speaking as a collective, and do our systems enable collective action, or are systems requiring us to stick in our own lanes and try the best we can?
Roshni,
Gail,
a quick comment on that, if I could.
Of course.
I was just thinking, as you were speaking, Anton made the point about within the competition law, he was talking about that element of it, which talks about benefits. And, I think you gave us 3 particular areas where you defined where it was okay to do things if there are certain benefits. I don't know, and I speak completely with no knowledge of this, Anton. Is there not the opportunity to start looking at adding in social and environmental broader objectives into those criteria that would qualify within that element of the law? Because those are common goods to all of society. But just as a reflection, yeah.
No, Shamila, and I think it's a very good question, and I think it a very relevant question and a global question, back to the point that I was making earlier. At the moment, there's sort of 3 points where the Competition Commission initially would come in. One is on mergers. The second is on these prohibited practices I was talking about. Let's talk not about collusion here, but coordinated conduct. And then the third one is granting an exemption. And I think in the context of mergers, there has been some development by the competition authorities, where they're trying to, I think, the South African Commission, where it's trying to apply the law in a slightly creative way. So where it considers a merger, it needs to look at the competition aspects, but also public interest aspects. And what it's doing in some of those public interest aspects, it's potentially widening it a little bit. So it's not a negative situation where if I came in, they would say I'm disallowing this merger because it's can I put it crudely, it's an environmentally unfriendly merger. But what they might say is this merger has significant benefits for the economy more generally because it is going to enhance certain environmental objectives. And they might then say, well, because of that, we think that's a positive tick for the merger. I mean, that's one aspect. I think the one other thing that struck me is from a competition perspective, if I'm doing things unilaterally, then there's not a concern. The concern really arises when it becomes coordinated, and in relation to competitors. And I think a lot of the stuff that is happening it struck me again as you were talking, where it's shareholder activism, it's foreign regulatory requirements, it's pressure, corporate pressure, it's shareholder pressure, it's consumer pressure, all of those type of things, which then lead to companies saying, I can get a competitive advantage by doing the following. So in other words, I unilaterally adopt a particular course of conduct. And then what happens is that triggers competitors reacting. I mean, the thing where it becomes more tricky from a competition law perspective is where you say, in order for this initiative to work, I need my competitors to do it with me, because if I'm the first mover, I run a significant risk, to your point about costing or whatever, putting it slightly, in order for me to make something which is going to be more sustainable, ultimately, it's going to cost me more. Consumers are going to have to pay more for my product. But if they've got the cheap alternative, which is hopeless from an environmental perspective, they can go to that. And that's the thing where often I think competitors say, well, can't we do this collaboratively? That's one aspect. And then another aspect is where you say there's a kind of a standard, and that probably fits into standard setting and the same type of thing where you've got that risk. And then the other one is where in order to do a reclamation or something of that sort, you want an industry initiative to get the economies of scale to make it justifiable. And I think those are the aspects where it becomes difficult. But I think what one needs to, from a competition law perspective, what one needs to be careful is that you don't baby in bathwater. Don't say, well, in order to achieve these objectives, just allow everything. You need to say, are these things that really require collaborative conduct? And I think the point that Roshni made right at the outset, which is, these are you don't want to wait till the crisis is so bad that we're really doing crisis management. You want to be able to do this proactively. And the problem about being very conservative about what you allow is potentially you do push yourself into that, gosh, we now sit with a crisis where if we'd done something collaboratively and proactively, we could have ameliorated the situation. But I think, to your point, I think it is something that our competition authorities are thinking about. And I think it's something that global competition authorities are looking at. I know in Europe there's also movement in this, but it's always this difficulty, which is if I need a principled line about why I allow something and I don't allow something else. And I think competition authorities are generally concerned that if they're too robust, that can have unforeseen consequences, in other ways.
Well, I think overall it's actually quite hopeful then. Thank you.
I hope I'm not overselling our authorities at the moment.
No, Anton, Judge Dennis Davies, who I always enjoy listening to, at a recent competition commission event, was saying that one of the greatest challenges in his mind facing the law over the last 20 years has been this very conservative legal culture and almost a myopic view of pure legal concepts without what he says broadening the prism to think and conceive law as it relates to the social context. And I completely understand that it's a fine line between collaboration and collusion, and we've seen that playing out in South Africa in various spaces. Just to summarize, does our competition law at the moment enable collaboration in any way? And to give you an example, have we lost Anton? I can see Anton. I can't hear him. Okay, so while we're waiting for Anton to join us again, Gail, let's turn to you then. When we first spoke about this conversation and I invited you to join us as what I believe is a key voice from the marketing and advertising industry, your comment was interesting, saying, I don't know how much value I can add to this conversation, but quickly we identified the World Federation of Advertisers Planet Pledge. Talk to us about the Planet Pledge and how is it positioned in South Africa?
Okay, well, there's the problem. I don't know how much I can contribute to this conversation because I'm not an expert on the Planet Pledge. I just know about its existence, and it is a movement started by the World Federation of Advertisers for companies to commit themselves to certain environmental and sustainability outcomes. that's as far as my insight into the detail goes. I don't know exactly what's in the Planet Pledge, but I do know the problem is there is a lack of appetite in South African companies to get on board with international projects like this because of all the challenges we face locally. So whenever we try and roll out any international type of marketing initiative, so for example, there recently was a global survey around racism and discrimination in advertising and within the workplace, within the advertising and marketing workplace in the industry. And there was this global project to do a global research onto it to get South African companies. And you think that's something that's a hot topic for us. You think that's something we've got something to say about. To get companies to respond was extremely difficult. We just have this low uptake. But it's an interesting project. I think that it's one that could maybe be driven with more. There could be a better attempt at trying to roll it out, but it just, we see again and again. It's very frustrating trying to roll out these sort of international, forward-thinking campaigns when we're on the back foot with so many things.
Gail, thanks very much. And, I was really excited to read that Planet Pledge. And I'll take you into a scenario that played out in my mind very early on in the 2020 lockdown. I went into the supermarket, and of course, all of us were very keen to boost our immune systems. And I said, well, what if I walked into the supermarket, looked at the food and vegetable aisle or any other food aisle, and it would tell me the content of the vitamin C, the content of the magnesium or any particular mineral in that, so that I can make more responsible choices. Because as much as I'm excited about nutrition and health and fitness, etc., someone else may not have that information available to them. And what I started thinking about was, what is the responsibility of companies and retailers in creating more informed choices among consumers? And absolutely, perhaps there is a space for the Planet Pledge, looking at also the social and the governance aspects, so that South African consumers can have that choice. Sometimes it's not affordable to make the right choices, but at least the knowledge and the awareness can be spread. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there is a lot of work in that area when you talk about the labeling of food and nutrients and that type of thing. There's a lot of work being done, in particular when it comes to high sugar, high fat content in products. That's a whole other area. And there are regulations in place about how accurate your labeling must be, and that you must declare all your ingredients and what allergens are in the products and things like that. So, unfortunately, when you're in the fresh produce aisle, you're not going to get a label telling you how much vitamin C your apple's got. But when you go into the other types of goods, the tinned goods, the packaged goods, you will get that information if you want it. It's not out there unless it's very interesting, unless the marketer feels that is a particular claim they can make. But on the whole, that information would be available. And like I said, especially when it comes to the marketing of so-called junk food to children, there is a lot of action locally and internationally in this. Again, though, whether the action goes to where the real problems are I've got a whole controversial view about the marketing of high sugar, high fat foods to children, and whether advertising is really the problem here. I don't think advertising is the problem. Exactly what you said, the affordability is a problem, but that it's getting into such a different area that I'm just going to stop speaking now.
Thank you, Gail. That was one example. The other example, when I was speaking to some citrus farmers in the Eastern Cape, the thought came into my mind that when we work for some corporate or some company, we carry that brand with pride to the extent that we love our employer. But to those working on the farms who get up at 3:34 in the morning to go to the farm, we go into the supermarket and buy the product with often the retailer's label, but there's no visibility of the farm name, the farmer. And from a consumer information perspective, if we want to start looking at tagging where our products come from, how sustainable the products are, what's the carbon footprint in those products, what's the water footprint in the product. Can we start thinking about these things more creatively and just reimagining what information we're putting out there? Those were just some thoughts. Anton, I see we have you back.
Sorry, those are the perils that we've all been talking about what keeps us perhaps from focusing on long-term things, short-term things like losing reception.
Yes, I don't know if you lost me before I was sharing what Judge Dennis Davies said at a recent Competition Commission event. And what he was saying was that one of the flaws in his view was that there's been a relatively myopic view taken of the law in that it focuses on legal concepts and doesn't necessarily look at how the law operates in the context of social issues, etc. So just to summarize for our own understanding, does the current competition law make any type of provision for collaborative arrangements?
It does, Roshni. So just to pick up on Judge Davis's comments, I mean, I think this is a point that he's raised on a number of occasions, and there's always this balance, I think, which is quite tricky between legal certainty, in a sense, and sort of pushing the boundaries. So I'm not differing from him in a sense. I understand exactly what he's saying, but even if you look at some of the new provisions in the Competition Act about the public interest issues, it's got nothing to do with ESG things, but more on transformation. And the question is, what do you advise a client on when there's a merger coming? What are the requirements? Because it's a little bit more diffuse now. It's a little bit less clear, and so that's the tension that you have. Is you need something that tells people what to do, how to do it, what you need to do to tick boxes. On the other hand, that can lead to a kind of sort of more constrained approach where the law is then applied in a way that appears to be a handbrake, and that's quite tricky. I think. Turning to your other question, I mean, again, as I say, it's only where it involves collaboration between competitors that this becomes relevant. So I think issues which are broader, which involve an entire sector, are less likely to give rise to concern. But where you've got a set of competitors who are collaborating, then what you need to look at quite carefully is either whether it's completely excluded from the scope of the Act, and that was that one thing that Shamila mentioned that I'd spoken about, which is concerted conduct which is designed to achieve a non-commercial socio-economic objective. But the critical thing there is what is non-commercial, and I know that the Competition Commission previously has struggled with that, and I think rightly, in the sense that if you give it too wide an interpretation, then a whole lot of things which could actually affect the competitive process are suddenly exempt from the scope of the Act. If you give it too narrow a construction, then what happens is a lot of genuine socio-economic concerted conduct falls within the Act. And the problem is, as soon as it falls within the scope of the Act, then you need to apply this balancing thing. Firstly, does it have an anti-competitive effect? If it doesn't, well, then you're fine. If it does have an anti-competitive effect, is it then outweighed by the three balancing gains? Is it pro-competitive? Is it efficiency enhancing? And I think, Shamila, that goes back to your question. What is efficiency enhancing? Is efficiency enhancing a narrow concept, an economic concept, or is it a broader concept? Can you give it a broader meaning? And that's, I think, an interesting question that will have to be developed. Or does it give rise to technological gains? And again, there, I think that is probably slightly narrow. There are some things that could fit within that scope. But once you've done that complex balancing exercise, and if the balance comes out on the wrong side, so in other words, the anti-competitive effect is not outweighed by any of those, then you need to go for an exemption, and that is a long process. So when one's thinking about how can rapid steps be taken which require collaborative action where either efficiency doesn't count, so you can't use efficiency to cover ESG objectives, or the gain is not sufficient to outweigh the anti-competitive effect of the conduct. Then the Competition Act is going to be a brake on collaborative action. So I think that those are the challenges. But I think, again, to the point that Shamila raised earlier, and it goes back to Judge Davis's point, where you start having international pressure, and I don't mean that pressure in the sense of what I said earlier, international regulations where people are trying to meet international regulations, but pressure in the sense of there's a general move in a particular direction. Then what happens is the competition authorities will move with that, and the courts will move with that flow, and you will have more creative. Sorry, I'm not saying that the courts and the authorities aren't being creative, but you might find that some of the phrases that seem to have a relatively narrow meaning might have a slightly broader interpretation which is given to them. But those are slow processes. It's not something that happens tomorrow.
And this is the issue, that these things all take time. So the sooner the right voices, if we can call it that, and the right minds can get into the same boardroom, because what I'm finding, Shamila, and please chime in if you think I'm on the wrong track, but what I find is that the same cohorts of people are continuing the conversations, but in different boardrooms. And how do we start kind of having these multi-stakeholder discussions across the sectors so that by 2030, our strategic plans and execution strategies actually achieve something quite different? What are your thoughts on that? And talk to us also around the recent Presidential Climate Commission in this context.
So, Roshni, I think there can be no doubt that we need to be able to get in one room and figure out what we need, for the country, and also that country exists within a broader global context as well, right? So there's this common responsibility, that common but differentiated responsibility, to follow the language of the climate negotiations. How do we do that? There's no doubt that there's leadership that's going to be required, and a level of boldness to be able to say, these objectives are actually critically important for all of us, and therefore we need to act. And it's going to, in some instances, require putting aside certain things that we're invested in or have gone down a certain path of, and saying, but actually that path is not going to lead to where we need to get to. So the first thing is the common objective, and the leadership to have the conversation around what that common objective is, and then to say, this is the path we have to take. And there's no doubt about that, whether it's the fact that we need to decarbonize our grid really quickly. And now it's not just about the green objective, it's about just having energy, right, in the first place. And, those sorts of things, and being able to have the leadership that says, we need to do this and we need to do it quickly. I'm under no illusion that those things are not easy to achieve, and we operate in a democracy where things do tend to move slowly. So I can't give you an answer as to how that needs to happen, except to say, yes, it does need to happen. It is going to take leadership, and it's going to take somebody, a couple of people to be quite brave about shifting the direction that we're taking. I also do think that we're at a point where we have the opportunity to do that now. I mean, we were already in a low growth environment pre-COVID. We already had struggles on those things. We know that we need a fundamental shift in our bases. And so those things need to happen anyway. And here's the opportunity to do it, to advance social and environmental objectives as well. And so that linkage of saying we can actually meet the economic objectives and achieve the things we need to hopefully achieve socially and environmentally is a great opportunity. But making those decisions now and changing the direction of the ship is what is really necessary to happen, if you have to ask me in short form. And maybe the consciousness and making people aware that needs to happen is one area we need to start and be able to push that a lot more, whether it's in business. And it has to be across the board, right? Because this is a coordinated effort between business, civil society, NGOs, the government. So there has to be that collective conversation on saying where we need to go, and then deciding that we're going to do it. And if it means removing harmful subsidies and certain things that don't serve us for the future, then maybe that's what we need to do. But that's around this whole conversation of a just transition, and the transition needs to happen on a number of different areas. And while we need to achieve some of those objectives, maybe environmentally or socially, we need to ensure that we don't exacerbate existing issues that we have. And that's, that whole just transition conversation is a conversation on its own entirely, right? To be able to say, well, what does that mean? And how do we, for example, say, I'm going to go down the path of needing to change to renewables, but then what have I done with all the jobs that are sitting in the coal value chain? And how have I changed those skill sets to be able to be fit for a change in that economy? How have I not left communities stranded, or left people with skills that they can't use, for example? So that is, all of those things are conversations we need to have, and to be brave about it. And then even so, in our little pockets now, to know that those things need to happen, and how do we influence change wherever we can right now, and at the same time pushing through whichever avenues we have, whether it's collective business organizations or civil society organizations, to say that, at that level, we need to create that consciousness with government, with those leadership structures, to be able to make that change and hopefully get us on the same page. Your second question, Roshni, was on the Climate Commission. The Climate Commission and its existence, firstly, I think is quite exciting, because it's signaling, at least on one element, that there is the intent to work together. It's produced the Just Transition Framework, for example, which is talking exactly about some of the issues that I've covered now. And but then again, it needs us all to get behind it to make it work. The frameworks are there, and I think we're great in South Africa at trying to get collective engagement and trying to have multilateral bodies and things like that. But then executing on those plans to get to an objective, it seems to be where we don't do that well, and those things need to change. And so if we want to achieve those objectives there, we need to get behind it, all of us, and say, this is critical for our country. We need to get behind it. Change the law if you need to, find the ways around it, find the creative ways to say there's an objective that we need to achieve, and how do we do that the best way we can. So, I think the Presidential Climate Commission is an enormously positive development, and what it's trying to achieve in collaboration, in visibility, in actually putting themselves out there. And we recently hosted the financial sector consultation on the Just Transition Framework for the Presidential Climate Commission. I think that was really exciting, for them to come and say, we need the sectors to work together, and let's have that conversation. Those are important and positive developments. And now it's going to be about, okay, we've spoken about it. Now, can we commit to the action that needs to happen? And we need to do it seriously.
Shamila, perhaps the missing link in all you've said is this trust deficit. Because what we're looking at is long-term outcomes, long-term commitments, and agreeing on a common vision in the best interest of South Africa. And to sustain efforts towards that end game is going to require an extra level of trust and commitment to get us there. And we haven't been great at that to this extent. So something's going to have to be done in a very different way. And, I was at the launch of the Presidential Climate Change online, of course, and tried to stay abreast of the other discussions. The climate between regulators in the private sector and that commission seems to be quite positive, and perhaps that is a good start.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that is a good start. The trust deficit issue, has been one for a while. And I think from a business perspective, I think what's positive is that there's certainly an increased expectation of delivery and responsible corporate citizenship, if I could call it that, from civil society towards business. So if you look at the trends in the Edelman Trust Barometer over the last number of years, and the barometer measures the level of trust that civil society has in each of business, NGOs, the media, and government, and it looked at that. And, for a while, the barometer, for example, was showing just a decline in the trust for business, right? Now, you can also expect, the other one that we've seen, which is the trend recently, was the decline in the trust in government and the media. And so that was very interesting to see the decline in that. But interestingly, over the last 2 years, I think it was the last 2 years, a pickup in the trust with business. And you probably look at that and a little bit surprised, right? Are they really trusting these guys? But I think what it's saying is that there's an increased expectation in business leadership to stand up and sometimes actually act in areas that are not considered its natural remit. to start having stronger opinions on issue of society and environment, for example, and things like that. So it was an interesting trend to have seen in that one, I guess one data point is the trust barometer and what it looks at. And so for South Africa, so obviously I'm referring to the stats for South Africa, and it looks at a number of different countries, and to see those trends. And the declining trust in government, for example, was one that seemed to be fairly common in a number of other jurisdictions. But I think for us, the positive was the increase in the trust in business. Now, the challenge, of course, is for business to make sure that trust is not misplaced.
Thanks, Shamila. So I think, the foreign business confidence, we want to revive that. It possibly starts with South Africa and South African leaders becoming more confident in South Africa's abilities to reach to a different place by 2030. Let's look at competition. So the Chief Marketing Officer of Diageo, Christina Diada, said, our success depends on us creating a positive impact on society wherever we work, live, and sell. This requires us to harness our brands and employees to ensure that we promote sustainable, inclusive growth and support the UN SDGs. So if we look at this principle of competition, as we know it from the third industrial revolution, we're now going into a new normal and a different way of doing businesses. Shamila, Gail, and Anton, how should we think of competition in perhaps a different way? Let's start with Gail.
It's an interesting thing you touch on, because it actually is something where there has been a shift in companies' attitudes to how they work with each other in advertising. But remember, advertising is all about saying, I know you're going to buy toilet paper, buy my toilet paper. So in advertising, you're never going to go, I know you're going to buy toilet paper, we're all great, let's work together to all be the best toilet paper, because that's not how your business grows. Advertising is about selling products. But we have seen an inching towards collaborative attitudes in that. So when you see an ad where a company has a go at another company, and in South Africa it will be very subtle because our rules are quite strict about that. Our trademark laws prevent that kind of out and out biting, clever, sexy advertising where products have a go at each other, but we see it happening subtly. What used to happen is the company would immediately be knocking on our door saying, make them stop, they're discriminating against our product, they're using our trademark, they're all that their claims aren't true, etc. We're seeing a move towards that the other product will then come back with a biting ad of their own. And while it's not collaborative in a sense it is, because in a sense it's going, let's work together to make more interesting advertising, rather than going straight to the regulator and asking the regulator to pull the advertising. And I think it's not exactly what you're talking about, but maybe it is a step in the right direction of how advertisers are thinking in a more creative way. But I do think we always are going to come down to that. Advertising is there to sell products, and it's there to sell my brand over your brand. And that is always going to be an issue. We might also, though, see a move towards brands, but then again, Anton's going to have to tell us whether marketers are allowed to do this, of going, well, if you're going to buy toilet paper, these brands all use recycled paper. Buy one of these brands, and that they might start advertising in a collaborative way on that they have a shared unique selling point, and they work together to advertise that shared unique selling point. So that could be an interesting way it could develop as well.
Gail, I think to me it links back to what Roshni said, and a thing that I've raised a few times, which is the fact that a company says we need to do the following is, in a sense, I mean, why, obviously put aside the altruistic side and potentially people recognizing that they're critical issues, sustainability issues, but there's also a commercial benefit that comes from that. So in a sense, I'm marketing myself as being a sustainable company, a company that's focused on sustainability, a company that is concerned about these things. And what's interesting then about what you just said is, if my competitors then react by saying, hang on, me too, essentially what you've done is you've moved the conversation. But the problem about it is it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. And I think it goes back to, how can you scramble these eggs very quickly? because how do you change the what is valued by consumers? Because if it's valued by consumers, then if I say I'm sustainable, ESG is important to me, people go, gosh, that's an important person. And I think a lot of companies are obviously thinking long term, because what I do today is going to have long-term implications, but it's also going to have long-term implications for me, which affects my competitiveness in the future. If someone says, well, it's great, you were a fantastic fellow now, you're as clean as a whistle, but you were filthy, 10 years ago, that's not going to be great for me. So in some senses, companies, I think, are probably adapting to what comes in the future. They are looking, I would imagine, Shamila, to what comes in the future. And I think that is a very helpful thing, and that is where competition, in the pure sense of the word, can drive change. Because if these are elements which are valued by consumers and important to consumers now and in the future, then people will compete with each other in order to be more sustainable, more focused on ESG.
And I think that's something we see it in other areas where one company comes out claiming something as a unique selling point, and next thing a whole lot of companies, and we suddenly have a whole lot of work around that where they're having a go at each other because I was first to the market, no, I was first to the market, and this is my claim, and no, that's my claim, and your claim's not true. And you see, when you see energy around claims, then something's happening in that space. And I think definitely, but one of the challenges is going to be to get consumers to see the value in those claims, not just the company and not just those who know, to get the real consumers, the consumer in the street, to see the value of the sustainability claims. And then we might see companies doing more exciting things around it.
Shamila, do you want to add anything on this point around reframing competition?
Sure, goodness, it's just very interesting for me, right? Because it's a little bit outside my day job to listen to all of this, yet I fully understand just how powerful those different things are. I don't think an opinion directly on it, no, Roshni. Mine is more around how do we make sustainable sexy? Because ultimately that's what you want, right? People are driven by what they think is cool, and you want it to still be cool for them, because the doom and gloom message lands with a few, but let's face it, that's not the one that's going to sell the product. And so how do you change that, and how do we get that to be sexy? I mean, the fact is that maybe in the short term it might end up with having to sell less, because if you really think about what we need to shift in relation to sustainability, it's a move from more linear models, which is what we do now, right? We're a heavily consumerism-based society. It's take, make, waste kind of approach. And as we move towards more circular concepts, and those are the ones that really are aligned with more sustainable development outcomes, we actually need to consume less. We need to have a product that you don't want to have to buy every month or every second month. You want, ideally, well, if I had my way, a car that ran for 20 years and you didn't need to change it every 5 years or whatever the case might be. But then changing it every 5 years, is it because I want the latest and the greatest, which is that appeal? Or is it because it's actually not a good product and I just want to change it? What drives that behavior? And so selling less actually might end up being where we need to get to. And higher quality, longer lasting, less material intensive is really what we want to get to. So how do we make those things sexy? I think, the marketing industry as a whole has a role to play in that, and making that appealing to people. So it's a slightly different take on it, but I guess that's my view.
Thanks, Shamila, and hence Gail's with us in this conversation today, right? So if we look ahead to 2030, Judge Dennis Davis also made a really interesting point. He said, we are at an inflection point and we need to embrace, in a sense, a new form of regulatory response to an era which began a long time ago, but we persist in examining the tools, legal and economic, which were born of a previous era. Yet we're stepping into a new space now. So let's start with you, Shamila. If we had to reimagine the investment case for SA Inc., fast forward to 2030, what, in your opinion, is the best outcome?
So, Roshan, reimagining the investment case for SA Inc. suggests that you're asking what somebody else thinks of us, right? And why they should invest in us. And what that somebody else thinks is going to be driven by what's important to them, or what they're either regulated on and have to do, or what's important to them, or what they see economic value in, ultimately to meet whatever objectives they have. So when we look at that, there's two sides to the story. The first thing is understanding where those trends are going to go, who those key investors are that we're trying to attract. And secondly, what's important for us as a country to do, to be able to ensure that we maintain our social foundations, and that we look at, and we meet environmental objectives, and we have economic growth. So there's two sides to that story, right? There's an element that says we need to own what's important to us and what's right for us to be able to do, and how that fits in the global context, because yes, we are dependent on some of those flows. So SA Inc. needs to, I think, get ourselves into a situation where we are hopefully able to extract better value from the resources we have in a far more efficient way than we have up to now. And there are a number of reasons for inefficiencies. I mean, some of them have been pointed already. You talked about infrastructure, some issues there. The elephant in the room is corruption, obviously. there's huge inefficiencies that just cost our economy, and there's so many things we possibly could be doing a lot better and being a lot more independent, and being able to do for ourselves without having the impacts of many of those things. Just like with any income statement, right? There's a revenue line and there's an expense line, and corruption is an expense line. So ultimately the profit is going to be eroded. So things like that, I think we need to work on. So our investment case for me is get our basics right. Make sure that we use what we have the most efficient way we have. Obviously, we need to consider the environmental objectives. When I talked about boundaries, planetary boundaries and things like that, I mean, it's a systemic issue, right? It cuts across everything that we need to think about. And being able to think within that context is going to become a lot more important for us. We obviously need to fix our social issues within the country. And again, it's systemic, right? These things are so interrelated. You can't just say that I can fix this one thing and everything else comes right. There are a number of things we need to do at the same time. And then the investment case, outside looking in, again, I think that's going to change because, to the point of, you're talking about what the judge said about what's happened, what Anton is saying now about what's happened in the past and what that system was premised on, and the realities that we face now, that we actually need to use that system to help us to enable a different future. Those things need to change. When I look at the market's perspective, it reminds me of a piece of work that I read a few years ago when I was writing my thesis that talked about market inefficiencies and market failures. And more recently, I think, there was another piece that was written, I can't remember the reference, that said that, fundamentally our financial systems, we're not premised on achieving the SDGs. That's not what it was built to do. So expecting that market is going to move on that very quickly and be able to enable that change fast is a bit of a difficult thing. So those systemic changes, all of them are not easy things to do. But what it's going to call into question is our fundamentals about what we measure and why, and what those things ultimately lead to. So understanding better that systemic impact, I think, are questions and hard questions we need to ask and we need to answer. And then, change the systems to be able to enable that outcome that we're aiming for. So it will all go back to understanding that vision, what we want to achieve, and then we have to change the systems to get there. It sounds simple on paper, right? And that's the kind of basis of any strategy, but that is what we're going to need to do. I would like to see a country that is definitely energy efficient and stable from that perspective. And I know these are basic things, but we know we're sitting in a context now where is that really that basic? I would like to see that we are acting in a responsible fashion towards the environment, that we're not depleting that thing on which we actually depend on to survive in the long term, that we've dealt with our water issues, and that, we have natural resources. What are we doing to do that, dealing with some of the issues you brought up earlier? Those things are critical issues, and that we have made a concerted effort to deal with inequality, to deal with unemployment in our country, and to start using the opportunity to create those industries of the future that long term will make our country competitive and relevant and have a place in the global context, and hopefully as independent on a number of different elements that we can actually create independence on, greater food security, those sorts of things. So it's not this wow thing maybe that maybe you thought I could say, but I really think that those basics in this short time frame of now to 2030 are the things we need to be focusing on and doing very quickly.
Thanks, Shamila. I think where we sit at the moment and with the issues we're grappling with, all that may sound impossible, but I believe that with sustainability, our strategies need to be aspirational so that they inspire us to think outside the box and apply some level of innovation to get us into a different space. Thanks for that, Shamila. Gail, to turn to you then, from an advertising and marketing perspective, how do we turn the tables on greenwashing and in South Africa apply principles of, let's call it, responsible marketing to change consumer behavior in a more sustainable way?
Well, as Shamila was talking, I was thinking, let's really think imaginary thing. And Shamila said a lot about basic systemic problems. And what occurred to me while she was talking is that what we need in South Africa is a more aware, more activist consumer who makes their purchase choices based on the sustainability of the product and is driven by these questions and wants to see products that support a sustainable future and wants to see those claims on their products. We are not going to get that until we fix the basics, until people are not worried about where they can get the best savings on their product because their children are starving and they don't have enough money, and people are not worried about their jobs, and people are not worried about their security, and people are not worried about their water, and people are not worried about their electricity. And until we address those things, we are not going to get that first world enlightened consumer that is going to drive a sustainability agenda in how they shop. Because our consumers at the moment just simply do not have that luxury. So my dream scenario is that we somehow fix the basic problems that we're grappling with so that we enable consumers to then think bigger than how am I going to get supper on the table, money-wise, electricity-wise, time-wise, and they can think bigger and they can think more hopefully and they can think more globally and they can start thinking about a sustainable future rather than the immediate problems of the day. That's my dream world thinking.
Gail, thanks very much. And I'm glad you used the term we, because each and every South African has a part to play, as small as you think it is. You know, if 50 plus million people play some part every day, we can start moving towards some type of solution. And I think that's the power there. Thanks, Gail. Anton, I know that the law is black and white and it's less agile in adaptation, but what are your closing thoughts on this conversation?
Roshni, I think I've probably raised most of the issues that I have. You know, I think there are positive movements. I think there are aspects where the law will change. I think but it does probably come back to what Gail's dream is, and which is when people value these things, and I know they're huge problems. The ones that Gail and Shamila and you have highlighted, then the competitive process will then drive a good result. The difficulty is in that initial stage where the big problems to deal with is how do we then deal with those problems? And it may be that some collaborative action is required there. And I think potentially, there'll have to be some creative thinking on relaxing some of the tight constraints, if necessary, that are contained in the Act.
Shamila, Gail, and Anton, a huge thank you for sharing your insights, your perspective, and most importantly, for giving up your time this morning to come and chat to us and our listeners. I think this conversation, we haven't possibly touched on all the key issues. We haven't necessarily put answers on the table, but I thought it was important to have this conversation nonetheless. So thank you. So whether you're new to ESG or whether you've done it for a few years, I trust that you've taken away some nuggets from this conversation, as that will inform your strategies in your personal space or in your business space. You can feel free to go to www.greenwash.com, where you can find some case studies on what's happening from the advertising and marketing space. Go to the World Federation of Advertisers website to have a look at the Planet Pledge. The JSE's website has quite a lot of good information for you to read up on and familiarize yourself with. And of course, if you need any information on marketing and advertising, you can reach out to Gail, and Anton at Norton's is available to discuss any questions you may have from the competition law perspective. So please visit www.stratastu.co.za if you are considering strategy and sustainability projects in your businesses, and let's see how we can help you there. In the meantime, remember to lift as we rise so that together we can thrive. Till the next time, take care and bye-bye.